Hi, class. This is Unit 2, Lesson 3, the lecture that's on the American Revolution, or more particularly on the War of Independence. So, this is the war lecture. Those of you that are war buffs should enjoy this one. Obviously, for the sake of this class, I will simplify some things. I won't tell about every single battle, I won't talk about every single detail. I will go through the major details, the major turning points. If you are a war buff, a lot of people interested in history are do consider themselves to be war buffs. There's lots more on this subject that you can find if you research online. But I will hit the major points of the American Revolution and how it led to the independence of the United States of America. So first, again, let me note that victory was not very likely. On paper, the British had a lot of advantages. The United States does not have a lot of advantages, but the advantages that they do have are going to be very instrumental advantages. The war is going to have multiple battles fought in it, obviously, but I will focus on some of the major battles that signified turning points. The Battle of Saratoga, in my personal opinion, is the most significant battle of the American Revolutionary War because of how it changes the course of the war. Basically, it brings France in and eventually some other countries in on our side. You'll have the Battle of Kings Mountain, which is a major turning point in the southern part of the war, which comes along a little bit later on. And then you have the final major battle, which will be the battle at Yorktown, Virginia. Uh, but before I get into the strategies, before I get into the actual battles, let's kind of look at how, on paper, the two sides of this war stack up against one another. So, again, we'll talk about the British advantages and disadvantages first, and then I'll talk about the American advantages and disadvantages. First off, with the British advantages, and you'll need to be a little bit careful on this lecture to make sure you are writing in the correct boxes. We're on the upper left box right now. When it comes to the British advantages, one of the big advantages is that they had a much larger population. They were about 3 times as big as the colonies were in terms of population, and the larger population that you have, the more troops that you can send to go fight. I'll talk more about this picture in a second. Another reason that the British are going to have an advantage is that they have a very strong government that can conduct this war. In other words, if the king wants to make certain orders for certain battles, it's going to be pretty easy for his authority to be respected. And basically, you'll see that he has a lot of control in conducting this war. Think of this as think of the British Army as an army or as a basketball team or a football team that has a very strong coach and everybody's on the same page, more or less. Interestingly, you'll see later on that not all of the generals are going to do exactly like the king or parliament want. More on that later on. Another advantage that the British are going to have is that they have a much stronger economy overall. They have more money to pay for this war, which means that they can pay for things like the warships that you see in the picture there. So, piggybacking off of the strong economy and the amount of money they had, largely because they had followed mercantilist policies for a long time up to this point, largely because of this strong economy, they do have the strongest military in the world. And so, for example, the picture here is a picture of what it would have looked like off the coast of New York City during the American Revolution, when the British sent many, many warships to help control New York City. On top of having the hardware needed, like ships, like guns, like bullets, the British, had the most disciplined military in the world. The soldiers were known for their discipline. They were known for being very precise in their actions. They practiced constantly, and they were a very difficult force to go up against. So one thing to keep in mind is that the British are pretty much the last country in the world that the colonists would want to have to fight a war against because they were so powerful. Note again that I said that these ships in this picture they would have appeared off the coast of New York City, not Boston. Not that long after Bunker Hill, General Thomas Gage, is going to be driven out of Boston by the colonists, by the Continental Army. I can speak more about that in a moment. The British did have some disadvantages. If you look at this map here, this shows all the land that was controlled by Britain, which is across the globe. And then you see Britain itself here. So this little island nation had proven itself pretty powerful by taking over land pretty much all over the place. In fact, there was a phrase that the sun never set on the British Empire. This map shows you why. Now, in the end, this proves to be a disadvantage because basically at this point, Britain's plate is too full. They are trying to control arguably too much territory, and one of its bigger colonies, the American colonies shown here, are now rebelling against them. And as far as colonies go, the American colonies were fairly large in terms of population. There are a lot of rebelling people. Another disadvantage is that in England itself, support for the war was pretty weak. Most of the British did not exactly like the idea of sending their loved ones, their family members, to go fight and maintain a colony on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean that they had never seen. You're going to see the same problem in the American Civil War. A lot of Northern citizens aren't going to want to fight the American Civil War because they're going to say, we don't care if the Southern states secede from the Union. That doesn't really affect us directly. Think to yourself today, if a state like Texas or California decide to leave the United States, there's not too many Americans that would be willing to go fight and possibly die to keep that from happening. So overall, the support for the war on the English side was pretty weak among its citizens. Another major disadvantage is that the British did not have what would be known as home field advantage. They were fighting somewhere else. They were fighting what's known as an offensive war. And an offensive war is always harder to fight than a defensive war. And a good parallel to this would be like fighting in South Vietnam during the Vietnam conflict. The United States had all the muscle power to take out the enemies in South Vietnam, but we did not have home field advantage, and that definitely played against our ability to win that war. Another thing worth noting, back to that point on offensive war, it's a lot easier to fight a defensive war. It's a lot easier to have the fight come to you than for you to bring the fight somewhere else. On top of that, the American colonies were rather large. There were hundreds of miles of coastline to control. There were thousands and thousands of square miles to control. So the English had a large area on their hands to try to control, and they would struggle with that. Now on to the advantages that the colonists had. The colonists had better military leadership. They didn't have necessarily the best troops. The picture here indicates troops that aren't exactly all in uniform. They don't exactly look well trained. Some of them seem to have brought their dogs along with them. But the military leadership was very superior. Obviously, George Washington will prove to be the major superior leader of the colonists, but there were others. It was around this point that, or I told you earlier that Boston had fallen back into the hands of the colonists. Eventually, another military leader, Henry Knox, had managed to sneak some cannons off the coast of Boston, pointed at Boston, and that helped prompt the remaining British troops to leave Boston. So by 1776, by mid-1776, Boston is back in the hands of the colonists. That's one of the reasons why Britain goes after New York City with its big navy instead. Another major advantage, like I said earlier, is the fact that the colonies are fighting a defensive war and they have home field advantage. So obviously having home field advantage and knowing the terrain is advantageous, but also fighting a defensive war is very advantageous. Some of you might play online war games, and even though it's frowned upon, you know that it's easier to get, quote, kills on those games if you wait for the people to run to you rather than you running to them. Floyd Mayweather Jr., famous boxer, he wins a lot of his boxing matches by fighting more defensively than offensively. So it's always easier to win a fight when you're playing defense. And the morale was much higher for the Patriots. They felt like they were fighting for their natural rights. They felt like they were fighting for the rights of Englishmen that they had been denied. They felt like they were fighting for their homelands. And in a lot of ways, they were fighting for their lives, because if they lost at this point, they could be hanged for treason. So the Patriots very much wanted to win this war, even though the deck was definitely stacked against them. So in what ways was the deck stacked against them? Well, first, I'm still on an advantage, excuse me. One of their big advantages is that they did not exactly respect the uh, the rules of war at the time. So honorable fighting in that day would include lining up in front of your enemy and firing upon each other out in the open, not being afraid to face your enemy eye to eye. Well, the colonists oftentimes would do ambushes. They would hide out. This was known as guerrilla warfare. They would attack. One of the other big things that was considered a no-no in those days was to fire upon the generals themselves, the commanding officers. You're only supposed to fire upon the average soldiers. Well, oftentimes American sharpshooters would go after the generals themselves in order to take away the leadership of the British. In other words, the American colonists were willing to fight dirty, and that will be an advantage they'll have over the British. Probably the biggest advantage that the colonists have is that they eventually get help from another major country. And that country is going to be France. France is not the only country that helps them, but it is the most significant country that helps them. This fight initially is almost like a little kid trying to fight an adult, but all of a sudden now that France joins the war, it's like another adult has joined in the fight. More on why France decides to join and help the American colonists later. And keep in mind that when you're fighting a defensive war, you don't have to conquer any territory. All you have to do is basically be willing to fight for 1 second longer than the other side. If you're fighting a defensive war, you just fight until the other side gives up and they leave you alone. That is a strategy that helps win the war against the British because the British do end up getting tired of the war first. That is a strategy that almost helps the Confederate States of America win the American Civil War. However, they do end up giving up. It is a strategy that the enemy in South Vietnam was able to use against the United States in the 1960s and 70s. So when you're fighting a defensive war, all you have to do is be willing to fight longer until the other side gets sick of fighting. You don't have to actually conquer the other country. Now on to the disadvantages. One of the big disadvantages is that whenever the Continental Army is formed, the Congress has a very hard time giving the soldiers pay. The soldiers usually were signed to 1 year contracts, and at the end of every year, they would be deciding whether or not to stay on board or go back home. And this was especially tempting to go home if you hadn't gotten paid in a while. They are going to be less organized. Remember, these were little militias. This is almost like volunteer firefighter groups that had been put together under a continental army. So even though the leadership of these troops was good, the military overall was underfunded and underorganized. And the reason for that was because the Continental Congress ends up forming a very weak government to try to orchestrate this war. They tried to form a government that was the opposite of King George III's government, which meant that the soldiers might not necessarily listen to what they say. This weak government could not pay the soldiers very well, so a lot of soldiers would end up leaving and going home. There was no real power to tax like King George III had with the colonists, and that's because a lot of colonists had gotten sick of taxes by the time the war started. So I made an illustration earlier that the British Army was like a basketball team or a football team with a very strong coach that all the players listened to. You're going to have almost the opposite the case when it comes to the military that the Congress is trying to organize. They can't pay them very well. They're less organized. Thank goodness that Congress had leaders like Washington to help make up the difference. So all in all, on paper, Britain should have won this war. And if France had not helped, they probably would have. Now, I'm getting ready to move on to a section of notes where you have boxes that point to sections on the map. It's very important that you pay attention to where the arrows coming off of these boxes go, because that's going to tell you where the fighting was happening related to that box. And if you look at the first box, when we talk about fighting in the northern area of the colonies, you're going to see that the fighting's taking place near and around New York. Now, I already told you that the British decide to set up camp in New York City. They're going to try to take over New York City. They've abandoned Boston at this point, at least for the time. And again, they're focusing on New York City. So, George Washington and his troops are going to head to New York City to try to save it from British control, and they're going to fail. So there are a series of battles that are fought in the effort to protect New York City. The one that I will mention will be the Battle of Long Island, and basically Washington's army gets defeated over and over again, and they're forced on a long and rather embarrassing retreat. So they will be driven off of Long Island, they will be driven out of the New York City area, and George Washington's troops are going to end up having to abandon the city. Now, at this point, there was a new general that was in charge of this area for the British, and his name was William Howe. William Howe's leadership style was completely different from Washington's. William Howe acted like, for lack of better words, a spoiled diva. He felt very entitled. He didn't like to fight when it was cold outside, so during the winter, he basically partied in whatever city he had conquered. Washington's leadership was much stronger, and we'll get more into that later on. But right now, Washington, because he has an inferior army, even though he's a good leader, has been driven out of the New York City area. And the Continental Army's morale was pretty low. Now, I told you before that Washington loses more than he wins, but he wins when it counts. And it's his leadership that matters. And basically, Washington is almost like a coach that has a team that's just suffered a losing streak. The best way to turn things around is to try to start a winning streak. And that's what Washington's going to do. Washington, at this point, is at the end of 1776. A lot of his soldiers were at the end of their contracts, and they were considering going home and not renewing their contracts to continue fighting. So what Washington needed more than anything else was a win. And he's going to get one by fighting a little bit dirty. So if you look at the next box, we're going to talk about Washington crossing the Delaware. In the course of the retreat from the British, Washington had been driven across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. And again, the Delaware River kind of creates that border between much of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So basically, you have Washington on one side of this river, and you have the British on the other side of this river. And on Christmas Day, George Washington is going to decide to do a sneak attack. Now, George Washington knew that the British and other German soldiers that they had actually hired in, called Hessians, mercenary soldiers, but he knew that he knew that the enemy wanted to celebrate Christmas, and he knew that this celebration would involve a lot of drinking. And so what Washington is going to do very soberly is going to plan an attack whenever the British are least expecting it. So after retreating across the Delaware River before, Washington is now going to gather his troops up and in the cover of night secretly cross the Delaware River back into New Jersey. Many of you have seen this iconic painting before. Again, this is Washington leading a sneak attack back into New Jersey, where he knows that he can probably catch some British troops or some of the German troops that the British have hired. He can catch them either drunk or hungover, or at least not ready to fight. And that's exactly what happens. So he does a sneak attack on a holiday, which is not exactly the cleanest way to fight. He is kind of fighting dirty here, but he's going to score the victories. So Washington's going to win two major victories at the Battle of Trenton and at the Battle of Princeton. There's a third battle that he wins. He wins a series of 3 battles total in 10 days, Trenton and Princeton being the major two. And again, this shows his leadership. He again might be fighting dirty, but whenever he does this fighting dirty, he gets the victories that were exactly what his troops needed. And so the morale, or the will to keep fighting, is going to go up among his troops. They score a few victories. They feel good about themselves. They have defeated the British, maybe not in the most upright of ways. Again, they did do a surprise attack on a holiday, on Christmas, but a win is a win, according to Washington and according to his men. And a lot of the soldiers decide to sign up for another year to fight under George Washington. Now, if you look at the notes, make sure you go to the left-hand box first. And at that point, you see that says Initial British Strategy. So what is the British strategy at this point? They've scored some losses recently. They lost Boston. They still have New York City. So you're going to have a map here in a second that'll help explain that. So again, make sure you're in the box that says Initial British Strategy. And if you look, here is where New York is. And what Britain's strategy is going to be is to basically, again, kind of cut the head off the snake. If you remember the old Benjamin Franklin cartoon with the snake on it and New England being the head of the snake, well, again, the English kind of saw the head of the revolution being the New England area. So basically, this area here, especially Massachusetts, was where most of the patriots were, and if they could be cut off from the rest of the colonies down further south, then maybe the war could be won that way. And honestly, is a fairly smart strategy, in my opinion. So, how are they going to execute this? Well, Canada, if you remember, was owned already by the British, and there were British generals there. And the idea was that one British general named John Burgoyne was going to leave Canada and head south, if you follow the mouse. At the same time, there was another general, well, one you've already been introduced to, General Howe, who at this point was in New York City. And what General Howe was supposed to do was start in New York, which I'm pointing at now, and move north. Once Burgoyne and Howe met together, they were, according to the plan, supposed to invade New England area, this area that I'm showing with the mouse now, and then they were going to basically take out the vast majority of patriots and then end the rebellion. Again, cutting the head off the snake. Again, they were supposed to meet somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle would have been Albany, New York, which you can see is right here. And then from there, they would invade New England, again, taking out the majority of the colonists that consider themselves to be patriots. I'll get into why that failed in a moment. If you look at the map, you can kind of see part of the reason why that fails. In fact, you can see the entire reason why that fails if you look closely enough. But I'll explain in a moment. So again, why were they targeting New England? Because most of the New Englanders were patriots, or the majority of patriots found themselves in New England, especially Massachusetts, where all those taxes and laws I talked about in the first and second lectures had hit the hardest. And so basically this was going to isolate the independence movement. And if you isolate the independence movement here in New England, there are patriots in other parts of the country, but a whole lot less. So if you take out the majority of them here, by cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies, the war could be won rather easily. So why does this fail? Well, because both parts of the plan fail. The first part of the plan, one part of the plan at least, is that Howe's going to start from New York and head north to go take out Patriot resistance and then meet Burgoyne. Well, if you look here, Howe decides to do his own thing, so he's not as disciplined maybe as he should have been. Howe is going to go somewhere else. And if you look at the map, you'll see that ultimately Howe is going to go after the capital of the United States, which at the time was Philadelphia. His idea of cutting the head off the snake would be to capture the government in Philadelphia, capture Congress. If you capture Congress, then there will be no way for the Patriot military, the Continental Army, to keep fighting. So his idea of cutting the head off the snake was to cut the government head off. The overall British strategy, however, was to cut the geographic head off, and Howe just basically doesn't do his part of the plan. It's like having a game plan to win a basketball game or a football game, and then the quarterback or the point guard doesn't go along with the plan, and as a result, the whole plan fails. Another reason that the strategy fails is because if you look here at the map, you can see that ultimately Burgoyne does not continue or does not have his invasion work successfully. He ends up losing a major battle despite having larger numbers at Saratoga, New York. So the reason that this initial strategy fails is because, one, Howe decides to do his own thing and go after Philadelphia, which he does conquer. And then number two, because Burgoyne ends up not making it all the way down to Albany, he ends up losing at the very, very pivotal battle at Saratoga. So ultimately what happens is that New England does not get cut off from the rest of the colonies, and Britain ultimately is going to have to change strategies, especially because after Saratoga, France decides to join the United States. So let's talk about what Howe does in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, to be honest, he is very successful. He does take over Philadelphia. He goes there because he wants to capture the Congress. He is going to be met by Washington's troops, and yet again, Washington's troops are going to fail to stop Howe in multiple battles. And in the end, Howe does take over Philadelphia. And his idea was that the revolution, which he felt had started in Philadelphia, that the revolution would fall apart. Now, did the revolution start in Philadelphia? Not really. It had started largely in the New England area. He should have followed the initial plan. The Declaration of Independence, however, had been signed in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the capital, and Philadelphia was where Congress was. Well, Congress manages to escape Philadelphia before Howe takes it over. So even though Washington lost the battles to save Philadelphia, he probably stalled Howe long enough for Congress to escape. And they end up going to a nearby Pennsylvania town called York, and they hang out there after losing the capital city. Notice that you can lose the capital without losing its government. That's going to happen again in the War of 1812. Later on, you'll see in the War of 1812 that Britain's going to take over Washington, D.C., but our government escapes in time to survive. So in the end, Congress is not captured, even though the town that they were residing in is captured. And Howe, being the sort of diva general that he was, is going to decide to take the winter off in Philadelphia once it got cold. So here we are, a year after Washington crossed the Delaware, a year after Washington had gotten his troops' morale up, and a year later you see that again Washington has suffered a series of defeats. Again, he has lost a major city, not New York this time, but Philadelphia, the capital. And the year is coming to an end. It's the wintertime. So you can guess what his troops are thinking about doing. His troops are thinking about leaving at the end of the year. So where is Washington during all this time while Howe is partying it up in Philadelphia? Washington's less than 20 miles away, hanging out in some ragtag shelters out in the open pretty much in an area known as Valley Forge. And most of you have probably heard of Valley Forge before. And basically about 18-20 miles outside of Philadelphia, Washington is going to be in Valley Forge. And by the way, we are now on the back side of the lecture. Washington is going to be hanging out on Valley Forge, and he is going to be struggling with his men. And this is very important. Washington was very wealthy by this point. If he wanted to, he could act like a British general. He could go find a city to stay warm in, a city to have fun in, and leave his troops and come back when things got warm again. However, one of the great leadership qualities of Washington is that if it was good enough for his troops, it was good enough for him. So if his troops had to endure a winter largely outside, where their shoes were wearing off, where they had holes in their clothes, well, Washington was going to do it as well. And that's very noteworthy because this is going to endear his men to him and his leadership style. And they are going to respect him quite a bit. Think about teachers that you've had. Think about teachers you've had that demanded a whole lot of you, but did not demand very much of themselves. And think how you respected them versus teachers that were demanding both of you and of themselves. So what ends up happening in Valley Forge is, again, Washington suffers the winter with his men, but in the end, the Congress is going to send in a European, kind of like a drill sergeant named Baron von Steuben, and he and Washington are basically going to spend the winter preparing for when things get warm again. So basically, they spend their time doing drills, upping their discipline, and in the end, what happens is that because of all this practice that they do while they have, if you will, an off-season, the soldiers are going to come out of Valley Forge with more confidence than they'd ever had before. It's during Valley Forge that his soldiers that had been kind of a ragtag group of soldiers beforehand become a real army. So after the winter ends, after the winter breaks, Washington's men are going to feel much stronger, much more confident, and ultimately they are going to win some battles once they start fighting again. Ultimately, they are going to win the final major battle of Yorktown, but not without French help. We'll talk again about the French coming up soon. If you look at your notes now, you'll see that you have a square, and the square is very bold. And usually, when I put something in bold, I'm trying to emphasize its importance. So if you look at where it says Battle of Saratoga, this is something to highlight, put star next to, underline it, make sure that you know it. So let's talk about the final part of the British New England strategy failing. Now, we already know that Howe decided to go for Philadelphia instead. He got the city, but he didn't get the government there. Now let's talk about the other failure, the failure of Burgoyne to take his part of the New England area, which again, he fails at Saratoga. So this battle is the turning point in the northern part of the war, and in my opinion, it is the biggest turning point of the war overall. Now, at this point, you need to remember that a lot of other countries weren't exactly fans of Britain. They were enemies of Britain. And if you think back not too long in our notes, you know that France doesn't like Britain very much. They had fought the French and Indian War against each other. So France would really love to join the American colonists, but they don't want to join a war that they think they're going to lose. Remember, it wasn't that long before that they had lost to the British in the French and Indian War. So this battle is going to be what convinces them to join. So American forces, led by a general named Horatio Gates, don't need to know it for the sake of this class, but that was his name. He is going to, despite being outnumbered, win at the Battle of Saratoga. There are other generals that were involved. I believe General Benedict Arnold was involved. He never got the credit he thought he deserved, and some of you know that eventually during the war he's going to switch sides and help out the British. But the main general that you need to know for this battle will be Horatio Gates. Again, he defeats Burgoyne, and at this point, any chances of Britain cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies is going to fail. Now, there was a man that I mentioned a while back, one of the founding fathers. I haven't mentioned him lately, and that's Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin had again been one of the signers of the Albany Plan of Union, the first time the colonies had ever thought about joining during the French and Indian War. He had helped Thomas Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence and had helped sign it. During the war, he was too old to fight. So what did he do? He went to France as a diplomat for the United States and kept on trying to convince France to join. And France loved Benjamin Franklin. His personality was pretty likable to most people. He was very, very charming. However, France kept saying no because they felt like they would be joining the colonists and they thought they'd be joining a losing side. Well, when the news of the Battle of Saratoga hits France, the French are suddenly seeing a light at the end of the tunnel for the American colonists, and it's this battle that convinces them to join the United States. Again, I do not believe that the American Revolution would have been successful had it not been for France helping. Why did France help? Because, one, the Battle of Saratoga convinced the French that the Americans could win, and number two, because Ben Franklin is a heck of a diplomat. Benjamin Franklin, multiple times along the way, does things that basically put us on the road to independence and helps found the United States. This is one of those times. He provides the diplomacy, Horatio Gates provides the military victory at Saratoga, and after Saratoga, France is going to help out, and France had a big enough navy to do some damage. More on how the French end up helping us win at Yorktown later on, but again, in my opinion, without French help, this war probably would have been lost by the American colonists. There are those that would disagree with me on this. French help was definitely essential. I cannot point that out enough. So at this point, the English or the British realize that they need to change strategies, and if you look at the map, you can see that now we're heading towards the southern colonies. So Britain's going to change their strategy, and they're going to try instead to go and invade the South. Now, why would they go to the South? This is not where most of the Patriots were, except for maybe in Virginia. The reason is because that's where most Loyalists were. And if that area of the country was already, overall, Virginia side, pretty in favor of Britain, then basically the idea was if you can make sure that you have secured the southern colonies, including North and South Carolina. Then from there, if you look at the mouse here, if you secure this area where people are already more loyal to you, from there you can springboard back into the northern colonies and restart the war and have a whole lot more support that you're springboarding from down here. So again, the idea was at least keep the southern colonies. Again, this is where a lot of the tobacco that the British wanted was being grown. And then they could, on top of just keeping the South, they could use this as a springboard to invade further north again. So there was a minimal mission here to keep the South, and if not, just keep the South, also invade further north again. Unfortunately, people don't like being occupied by British troops, and you'd think that the British would have learned this from what happened in Boston. So what ends up ultimately happening is that the southern colonies are going to start to know what it feels like to live in Boston. They're going to start to know what it's like to have British troops everywhere, telling them what to do and sometimes taking things away from them, raiding them for supplies, basically doing a southern version of the Quartering Act. So in the end, the British make a big mistake here because the South turns on them and loyalists become patriots in the South. So how does this happen? Well, first, the British are going to capture Charleston, and I do believe it was called Charleston, not Charlestown at this point, but I'm not sure, but same difference. They are going to capture Charleston, and again, if you look at the map, you can see they were pointed at South Carolina. They capture Charleston, and then they brutally invade South Carolina and take over pretty much all of the colony of South Carolina. The general that is put in charge of this part of the campaign is going to be a man named Charles Cornwallis. If you live in western North Carolina, then you probably have seen that name around. Cornwallis did a lot of his dirty work in the western Carolinas. So Cornwallis is going to go through South Carolina and conquer the Carolina countryside, and then on top of that, he is going to decide to go for North Carolina. Won't make it, at least not the way he expected. Now, one of the things that the British troops do that infuriates Southerners the most is they start to free slaves. They start to tell slaves that if the slaves fight on the side of the British troops, then they will be freed from slavery, and obviously that would be very enticing if you were a slave. It's going to be very infuriating if you are a white slave owner, one of the leading members of society in Virginia, or in South Carolina, or in North Carolina, and in the South. So, again, whenever they start to free slaves and the slaves start to fight against the American colonists, again, you can't blame the slaves. They're basically fighting for their freedom. It's going to anger the Southern leaders. Okay, now, be careful where you go in the notes. Go to the box that says the Battle of Kings Mountain. We're going to do that one first because that's a big turning point in the South. So, with the Battle of Kings Mountain, and again, if you'll look at the map, you can see that the box is pointing to somewhere close to the North and South Carolina border. This will be the turning point in the South. If you look at the map, a lot of people from western North Carolina are going to team up, and they are going to come from all over, even crossing the Appalachian Mountains. The ones here that I'm highlighting with the mouse, they cross the Appalachian Mountains to help save North Carolina, and they are known as the Over Mountain Men. Overall, you're going to see patriots from all over the South, from North Carolina, from Virginia, from what is now Tennessee, even though Tennessee wasn't a colony. You have people from all over this area, all over the Appalachian area, come in, and they are going to meet in Morganton, and then from Morganton they're going to go south, and they are going to face off against the British at the Battle of Kings Mountain and basically save North Carolina from invasion for the time being. So keep in mind that at this point, the Southern colonists are starting to turn from loyalists to patriots. And at this point, Cornwallis's invasion of North Carolina has been stopped. He is going to regroup and he's going to make another attempt to invade North Carolina, and that attempt will also end up being a failure, and I'll explain that whenever I get to the box that says Cornwallis versus Greene. One other thing to note is that whenever the British needed supplies, they could usually count on supplies coming in on the coast. Notice how far away they are getting from the coast. And I'll show you in the map here in a second. well, maybe the next slide. But I'll get to it in a moment. Keep in mind this idea that the British are getting further and further away from the coast, which means they're getting further and further away from supplies, and that means they're going to have to start plundering the colonist homes. That will not go over well. On top of that, it's hard to get supplies even to the coast now that the French Navy has gotten involved. Again, let me emphasize the help that France gave. Okay, so Nathanael Greene. Nathanael Greene was an essential general in the southern part of the American Revolution, and he is going to be instrumental in turning most of the South against Britain. So remember that the South was supposed to be in favor of Britain. That is where most loyalists were. They weren't used to having to deal with a lot of British troops. They weren't used to being harassed by British troops. That was a Boston thing, right? Well, no longer. Now the South is going to start getting the same sort of treatment. Now, what's interesting about Nathanael Greene is that he actually loses virtually every battle, if not every single battle. What he would do is he would basically attack Cornwallis's troops and then back away. Then attack again and back away. He does a lot of, if you will, hit and run attacks on Cornwallis's troops. But what he does in the course of doing this is he baits Cornwallis to continue to chase him. And the longer that Cornwallis chases him, the more that Cornwallis's British troops run low on supplies, the more tired they get, the more that they're going to start basically invading and plundering the homes of Southerners. And in the end, Greene is going to lose every battle, but the actions of Cornwallis's troops will turn the Southern colonists in favor of Greene, in favor of the Patriots, and against the British. So again, like I said before, now that Cornwallis has been baited into chasing Greene all over western North Carolina, his men are going to run low on supplies, and they're not close to the coast. They can't go get a resupply at, say, Charleston. And so they're going to have to plunder and loot the southern homes. And if they came across slaves, they would offer them freedom in exchange for fighting on the British side. And that, of course, infuriates a lot of the American white colonists. And the point has been made over and over again. Let me make it again. At this point, the South is increasingly turning against the British. This entire strategy of using the place where all the loyalists were, the South, as an advantage, becomes a disadvantage. This plan completely backfires for the British. So again, Greene is going to lose every battle, but he ends up winning the war. And that's very interesting. You can lose every battle, but you can lose every battle but win a war. In the Vietnam War, the United States was able to win virtually every battle. But the longer that the United States was there, the more that even the good guys in South Vietnam grew to dislike the United States' presence, and in the end, a lot of them turned on the United States as well. You can have all the muscle in the world, but that does not mean that you control the territory. The British were pretty good at controlling towns and cities. They were not good at controlling the territory between the cities. And again, Greene ultimately helps turn the South against Cornwallis and against Britain. If you look at this map here, you can see that Cornwallis, after being turned away at Kings Mountain, he's going to start trying to invade North Carolina again. However, he is going to basically be on a wild goose chase after Nathanael Greene for a very long time, plundering Southern homes all along the way, freeing Southern slaves, angering the South, and then eventually Cornwallis will give up. So again, by the end of all this, after several years of fighting the American Revolution, Britain only controlled a few major cities. They controlled New York City still, I believe, at this point. They controlled Charleston. They had been driven out of Boston, and I believe by this point they had abandoned Philadelphia just to make sure they could control New York City. So Britain had very little control of the colonists. They had a few major cities, but in the South, they pretty much had Charleston and not much else. But again, they could not control the countryside in between the cities. And so Nathanael Greene, a genius, a military genius, loses every battle but wins the South. And at this point, Cornwallis is going to be tired. He's going to be undersupplied. And he's going to say to himself, and if you look at the mouse now, he's going to say to himself, I need to go back to the coast where I can get resupplied. And if you look, he's headed toward Yorktown, Virginia, anticipating that he can get resupplied there, not anticipating the French are there to help out the Americans. And by the way, Washington will be there too. So now we go to the finale of the American Revolution, and that will be the Battle of Yorktown. So Cornwallis is going to march to Yorktown, which is on the coast, and he's going to be awaiting a supply from the British Navy. And unfortunately for him, fortunately for the United States, the French have cut off a lot of this trade already. On top of that, there are French soldiers that are also helping out against on land against the British. So what ends up happening is that Washington's men, you can see Washington's headquarters right here where the mouse is pointed, and French troops are going to basically surround Cornwallis at Yorktown and put him under siege, which basically means surround him and keep him from getting out. If you look over here, you can see the French Navy is also surrounding, so he has nowhere to leave. He can't leave on a British ship. He is surrounded, and he is going to eventually have to give up. So Cornwallis, again, he's assuming that Britain still had control of the Atlantic Ocean. He's assuming that the British Navy was winning, and the French were doing a better job at this point. So his ideal was that Britain would resupply him and he could go fight again, live to fight another day. When he gets to Yorktown, he finds out that he's surrounded by the Americans and by the French. And ultimately, he's going to try to resist. He was hoping to get more help from other British generals, and they do not give him the help that he needed. And in the end, he's going to have to give up. So again, Washington and French allies are going to join together to surround Cornwallis at Yorktown, prevent him from getting resupplied, prevent him from being able to escape, and he had thousands of troops. If Cornwallis fails here, then it's basically the end of the war. It would be such a loss for the British military that they would not really realistically be able to recover. So again, the French Navy had already captured the coast along Yorktown, no resupply for Cornwallis, and no escape. If he tried to escape on land, he's going to meet Washington and other French troops. And by the way, Washington's troops, if you remember, were much stronger and more organized at this point. They had gone through the trials of Valley Forge. They had come out stronger. It had unified them. And back to Washington's leadership style, remember that a good leader is one that can unify those that are following that leader. And by kind of forcing them to go through a rough winter together and train and become a better team throughout the winter, he unified them under his leadership. Oftentimes, it's trials and tribulations that bring people together, and that's what happens at Valley Forge. And now, Washington can use these troops to help take out Cornwallis. So Cornwallis will surrender. His 8,000 troops will be captured. And Washington, Washington, I believe in this picture, was accepting the sword from Cornwallis, which would be symbolic of surrender. What's interesting is a lot of the troops under Washington wanted to gloat and brag and pick on Cornwallis and his men, make fun of them for their loss. Washington's going to tell them not to do that. Even in such a major, stunning military victory, Washington kept his dignity and the dignity of his men. Again, a great leadership quality. He had good sportsmanship, if you will. So when the Battle of Yorktown, when the news of the Battle of Yorktown reached Britain, people in Parliament said, "Oh, the war is over." And for the sake of this class, it pretty much was. Now, what ends up happening is King George III is pretty stubborn. He does not want to lose one of his colonies. That is a major pride issue. The war drags on for a couple more years, but at this point, the war essentially was over, and Yorktown was the final major loss for Britain, final major victory for the United States. So the next question is, what ends a war? And stopping fighting does not end a war. Even surrendering doesn't end a war. What ends a war is a peace treaty. So if you look at that map there again, that shows the southern campaign that I described. You see how Cornwallis took out Charleston, then got turned back at Kings Mountain, chased Nathaniel Greene all over the South, turned the South against the British. Then Cornwallis went, tried to get resupplied at Yorktown, gets surrounded, and he surrenders. Okay, now, and by the way, you can see how Washington had come in specifically to help surround and capture Cornwallis. Now back to the idea of a treaty. It takes a peace treaty to end a war, and officially, and the Treaty of Paris of 1783 is that treaty. Now, it's important to note that this is different than the Treaty of Paris of 1763. That's the one that ended the French and Indian War before the Declaration of Independence. This is a different Treaty of Paris after the Declaration of Independence in 1783. And notice in the painting, who's there? Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin shows up at all these major moments. Here he is in a painting where he and other diplomats are posing for the signing of the Treaty of Paris. You'll see a blank space on the right-hand side. That blank space is where the British diplomats were seated. They were so embarrassed that they refused to sit down long enough to have their portrait made. So what did the treaty do? Well, first off, it ends the American Revolution. The war is over. And Britain will officially recognize the United States as a new independent nation. So now the United States of America is official. Another thing it does is it says, the treaty says what land the United States now owned. And interestingly, it was not just the 13 colonies, which are now officially the 13 states. It also said that the United States owned all the British land all the way to the Mississippi River. And I'll give you a moment to get those notes taken. If I go too fast, you may want to pause because I'm about to go to the map to show you what the United States looks like at this point. So again, the United States not only has the 13 original colonies, now turned states, it also has all the land west of these states all the way to the Mississippi River. And there will be issues with that territory that has not yet become states. So again, if you look at the map on the left-hand side here, you'll see that before the war started, that the British owned what is now Canada, pretty much all of that, and all the land east of the Mississippi River, and that the Spanish owned everything to the west of the Mississippi River. After the war is done, and if you look at the key, you can see where it says United States, the color key. Now the United States owns virtually everything west of the, east of the Mississippi River. Notice that Florida has been given to Spain. Why is that? Well, Spain was one of those countries that helped out the United States, so Spain wanted to get something out of the deal. So Spain at this point owns Florida again. They had lost it at one point earlier in history. Now they have it back. So basically, the United States has everything east of the Mississippi River, except for Florida, which is owned by Spain. There is some disputed territory with Spain, and we'll come to that later on. And then they own everything up to what is now Canada. Let me make note of one other thing, and that is this area right here. If you remember, in the French and Indian War, this was the land that the British colonists, which are now the United States, this is the land that they had fought for against the French. If you remember, the French had built forts in this area, which will be known as the Northwest Territory. More on that later. Even though this land is given to the United States, the British are going to continue to occupy those forts in this area that they had taken from the French during the French and Indian War. Why do I bring that up and spend time to make a point of it now? Because eventually the Americans are going to start moving across the Appalachian Mountains in large numbers. There is no more proclamation of 1763. This is land owned by the United States. What the British are going to do is they're going to continue to occupy these forts, and they're going to start handing off weapons to Native Americans, and these Native Americans are going to start attacking American settlers. A few decades after the American Revolution, there's going to be a second war against the British, and that will be known as the War of 1812. And the conflict over that land that I was pointing out just now is going to be one of the major causes of the War of 1812. And finally, I'll close. The idea of this war being called the American War of Independence would be accurate. This is the war that gets us our independence. Eventually, in Unit 3, we'll talk about the War of 1812, where we fight against the British again. Sometimes it's called the Second War of Independence. The first one, we gained our independence in 1812. We're going to secure it. We're going to keep it for good. Long story short, Britain's not done messing with us yet. We are an independent nation, but Britain does still have troops in these forts here, and we are not happy about it. More on that later.